Now they do this, of course we have to ask the same question, why do they do this? Clearly they are concerned, at the same time they don't adopt a view of taking the welfare of everyone in the world and giving it the same weight as their own. As it was well put by Edgeworth, he said, for example, a person in a calm moment, their neighbour's utility compares with their own, neither counts for nothing, nor counts for one, but counts for a fraction. And I think a useful way of thinking about this is that when people do, and this comes out from various qualitative research we've done discussing with people who give money to charities, that they tend to think of it in terms of identifying an understandable group of recipients, like a family or a village, and that they see themselves as helping on almost a sort of one-to-one basis, not seeking to solve the problem of world poverty, but of their resources going to, for example, paying the salary of a trainee teacher in Kenya. I took this example from the Oxfam website. Charities clearly use this very much in their fundraising, and I mentioned Oxfam particularly because Amartya was honorary president of Oxfam for a number of years. And by framing the issue in this way, individual donors can both express their concerns and at the same time not be overwhelmed by the enormity of the size of the global problem. And it seems to me we could think about the national government's objectives in the same sort of way. The UK alone cannot bring about global justice. The Netherlands alone cannot bring about global justice, although I should say the Netherlands does a better job at doing so. It gets further towards doing so than the UK does. The UK is only 6.5% of the population of countries that make up the donor community. But it can be expected to bear its proportionate share. And in fact, it's broadly the case if you take, say, for example, the Millennium Development Goal, the poverty goal, the first of the Millennium Development Goals, the proportion of people below that poverty line is broadly the same as the proportion of people in the donor countries. So it's roughly a one-to-one relationship. And so that would mean the corresponding case to my example of the teacher in Kenya would be the British government taking responsibility, proportionate responsibility, for 65 million people below the Millennium Development Goal poverty line. And here I think I can report some positive news. One very interesting feature of today's debate about austerity programs is that there's widespread agreement amongst British policymakers and politicians on the need to ring-fence overseas development assistance and protect it from cuts. And there's a very interesting contrast. I said to you I've been reading the papers for 1976 and the IMF imposed cuts then. At that time, overseas aid was one of the first candidates for being cut. So there's been a shift, and I think much as I've been critical of the British government, I think that owes a lot to the moral leadership of first the Labour Prime Ministers Blair and Brown, and then to the present government. Now the final slide, you will see, not in glorious technicolor, which it would have been if we'd been in a modern lecture theatre, but I must say this is a much nicer venue to talk about these issues. I've summed up. It falls into two parts. I've taken a branch of economics, public economics, and considered how the current mainstream approach needs to be modified in the light of the idea of justice. What I believe the students on public finance courses should take away from reading the book which I tell them to go and read. In some respects, the subject has moved in that direction. The use of looking at tax reform, expenditure reforms, rather than seeking optimality is clearly already well incorporated. And I think that the recognition that the enthusiasm for engineering solutions, epitomized by the optimal tax literature, does need to be blended with earlier public finance traditions of considering different conceptions of justice. But at the same time, I think public economics has a great deal to learn from the idea of justice. The subject has been slow to absorb new ideas for alternative evaluative bases, that in fact, thinking about the case for and against public spending in terms not of willingness to pay, but in terms of the enhancement of capabilities, is clearly something which, in the mainstream of public finance at least, has not yet been taken fully into account. And public economics, while extending its positive analysis to allow for international interactions, has, I think, failed to develop a normative approach to global justice. So I've taken a discipline, and I've also taken an application. And the application is to the current discussions about austerity, and suggested that the standard way of thinking does help us disentangle some of the different arguments, to know what exactly is being proposed, whether it's an argument based purely on the need to meet the deficit, or whether it's related to an apparent reduced willingness to pay, or whether it's related to a shift in distributional values. These arguments are often confused. But at the same time, the analysis needs to be extended to take on broader approaches to the evaluative base, and that these may then lead you to think differently about priorities. Particularly, I've suggested that there's an important intergenerational element, with more being done to protect the spending which benefits younger generations, and that unlike previous budgetary adjustments, public investment should not bear a disproportionate burden. And finally, in providing a basis for national policy directed at global justice, one of the important themes of the idea of justice, I have commended the decision by the UK government to ring-fence overseas development assistance. So while I've been somewhat critical of my own government, and probably by extension to other governments, of what they're doing, I'd like to end on that note, because that is an optimistic and constructive note, one I think which is appropriate in a lecture honouring Amartya. Thank you.